Something shifted in the early hours of a frozen January morning in Sarnia, Ontario, and it wasn't a headline, a press release, or a government announcement. It was a truck, then another, then 1,000 more. And when the numbers finally came in for all of 2025, they confirmed what the logistics industry had quietly known for months. The most important trade artery in North America had moved, not collapsed, not closed, moved. The Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia had recorded 2.1 million commercial truck crossings, edging out the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor by 200,000 trips, the first time in decades that Detroit had been dethroned as the busiest commercial crossing on the entire Canada-US border. That gap did not close in early 2026, it widened. In just the first 3 months of this year, 531,732 trucks crossed at Sarnia, compared to 496,796 in Windsor. A difference of nearly 35,000 crossings in a single quarter. This is not a story about infrastructure. This is a story about power, about who controls the physical pathways through which $3.6 billion in trade flows every single day between Canada and the United States. And right now, 3 of the most consequential decisions in North American trade history are converging at the same moment. A privately owned monopoly bleeding traffic, a billionaire family spending millions in Washington to protect its grip, and a $6.4 billion publicly funded bridge sitting fully built, fully tested, fully lit, and still not open because a president decided to make it a bargaining chip. Think about what that means in concrete terms. Every week the Gordie Howe International Bridge doesn't open, economists estimate the region absorbs up to $7 million in economic losses. Every week, supply chains that depend on precise, predictable crossings are operating on workarounds. And the workers absorbing those disruptions, the truck drivers rerouting an extra hour north through Sarnia, the line workers at Windsor area automotive plants watching inventory get delayed. They don't get a Truth Social post explaining why. They just get the bill. Meet the people at the center of this story. They are not politicians. They are not lobbyists. They are the estimated 150,000 workers in the Detroit-Windsor corridor whose jobs are directly tied to what crosses that river. Auto workers, logistics coordinators, steel handlers, people who live and work in communities that were built around the assumption that the flow of trade through their backyard was stable, predictable, and protected from political maneuvering. That assumption is now gone, and what replaced it is something far more volatile. We know this because the data trail is unambiguous. The Bridge and Tunnel Operators Association, not a think tank, not an advocacy group, an industry body that compiles and verifies crossing data, confirmed the shift. The Federal Bridge Corporation Limited, a crown corporation of the Canadian government responsible for operating the Blue Water Bridge, confirmed that it had surpassed all other international crossings in commercial traffic volume. 3 separate outlets, including CBC News, the Detroit News, and CDL Life, independently verified the crossing figures using the same underlying data source. There is no dispute about what happened. The only dispute is about why and who benefits from which version of the answer. The toll gap is the starting point, but it does not tell the complete story. At the Ambassador Bridge, commercial tolls for a standard 5-axle semi-truck can reach as high as $27 per axle in Canadian dollars, translating to a cost of roughly $135 per crossing for a typical rig. At the Blue Water Bridge, the same truck pays approximately $7 per axle, or around $35 per crossing. That is a difference of $100 per crossing. Multiply that across a fleet of 50 trucks making 3 crossings a week, and you are talking about $780,000 in additional annual costs for a single mid-size carrier. That is not a rounding error. That is a budget line that determines whether a trucking company can compete. And here is where the story becomes something more than just economics. Because that toll structure, the one that costs trucking companies $100 more per crossing, did not happen by accident. It was set by a private company, a family company, one that has spent decades operating as the only game in town and pricing accordingly. The Ambassador Bridge is one of the only privately owned international border crossings in North America. It was purchased in 1979 by a Detroit trucking entrepreneur named Manuel "Matty" Maroon, who recognized early that owning the physical artery through which a quarter of all U.S.-Canada merchandise trade would eventually flow was not just a business, it was a dynasty. Forbes once estimated the bridge generates more than $60 million in annual toll revenue. By 2020, the year Matty Maroon died, the bridge was valued at somewhere between $1.5 billion and $3 billion. His son Matthew inherited the business, the lobbying apparatus, and the existential threat that had been looming since 2012. The Gordie Howe International Bridge. Picture the room. It is February 9th, 2026, Washington, D.C. Matthew Maroon, chairman of the Detroit International Bridge Company, has just left a meeting with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. The conversation, according to reporting from the New York Times, covered the competitive threat posed by the incoming Gordie Howe Bridge. Lutnick then picks up the phone and speaks to President Trump. Hours later, Trump logs on to Truth Social and posts a statement that sends shockwaves through the diplomatic and logistics communities on both sides of the border. He writes that he will not allow the Gordie Howe Bridge to open until the United States is, in his words, fully compensated for everything we have given them, and until Canada treats the United States with fairness and respect. Read that again. A bridge that Canada paid $6.4 billion to build. A bridge whose 2012 agreement was negotiated, approved, and signed with Michigan under then-Governor Rick Snyder. A bridge for which the U.S. State Department issued a presidential permit in 2013. A bridge that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection formally designated as a Class A port of entry, effective March 2, 2026. Trump looked at all of that, the agreements, the permits, the legal frameworks, and posted that he would block it. And somewhere between the Lutnick phone call and that Truth Social post, what had been a logistics story quietly became something else. It became a test of whether a president of the United States could weaponize critical infrastructure to protect the toll revenue of a billionaire donor. Because that is what the receipts show, and the receipts do not lie. Receipt 1. In January 2026, roughly 3 weeks before Trump's Truth Social post threatening to block the Gordie Howe Bridge, Matthew Maroon donated $1 million to a political action committee supporting Trump. The Maroun family has been a consistent and significant donor to Republican candidates and committees for years. Federal Election Commission data shows that in July 2025, Maroun made 3 separate donations to the Republican National Committee, totaling $250,000. The bridge company simultaneously hired Ballard Partners, one of Washington's most connected lobbying firms, founded by Brian Ballard, a figure with direct ties to Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, paying them $250,000 to lobby the White House, Congress, and the State Department on, and this is the exact category listed in the filing, international bridges. An analysis by CBC News found that it was the most lobbyists the Ambassador Bridge Company had retained since 2005. The timing of those payments and the timing of Trump's post are not a coincidence. They are a correlation so precise that the conclusion requires no speculation. But that's only part of it. Receipt 2. The Maroon family's financial exposure to the Gordie Howe Bridge is not a speculation. It has been modeled by economists at Michigan's own universities. Chris Douglas at the University of Michigan Flint and Jason Miller at Michigan State University both independently estimated that the Maroon family stands to lose approximately $30 million annually in toll revenue once the Gordie Howe Bridge becomes operational. That number does not include the collateral losses, the duty-free store at the Ambassador Bridge, the warehousing operations, the ancillary trucking and logistics businesses that depend on captive traffic volume. Economists noted that because the Detroit International Bridge Company is a privately held corporation, it is not required to publish financial data. The full magnitude of what the Maroon family stands to lose when they are no longer the only crossing in Windsor, Detroit, is unknowable to the public. That opacity is by design. You cannot lobby against a threat you have officially disclosed. Think about what this means for the worker standing on the line at a Windsor auto plant. He clocks in at 6 a.m. His shift depends on parts that cross the river just in time. Those parts move through a crossing priced by a private company with no public accountability, lobbied for by a family with a direct line to the Oval Office, on a timeline being manipulated for reasons that have nothing to do with his output or his paycheck. He doesn't know any of that. He just knows his line keeps stopping. Here's where it gets worse. Receipt 3. The Gordie Howe Bridge's commercial toll structure was announced in March 2026 under a discount program called Breakaway. Under that program, the commercial rate is set at $6.90 US per axle, compared to as high as $20 US per axle at the Ambassador Bridge for similar users. For a 5-axle semi-truck, that is a savings of more than $65 per crossing compared to Ambassador rates. The Federal Bridge Corporation confirmed that over 5,000 accounts had already been opened and 12,000 transponders ordered through the Breakaway program before the bridge had even announced an opening date. Trucking companies are not waiting. They are pre-registering. They are reallocating route plans. They are already treating the Gordie Howe as an active part of their logistics network, and the bridge is still closed. When it opens, the immediate demand is not a projection. It is already sitting in a database waiting to be activated. And this next one is the receipt no one in Washington wants to talk about. Receipt 4. The 2012 agreement between Canada and Michigan, the one Trump called unfair, was not structured to benefit Canada at Canada's expense. It was structured specifically because Republican legislators in the Michigan State House refused to allocate public funds for a new bridge. Canada stepped in and offered to finance the entire project, covering not just the bridge span itself, but the U.S. Customs Plaza, the highway connections on the American side, and all supporting infrastructure. In return, Michigan received joint ownership of the bridge and the right to receive 50% of net toll revenues after Canada recovers its initial investment. Michigan gets a world-class piece of infrastructure, joint ownership, and a perpetual revenue stream, without spending a dollar of state money. Trump called that unfair. The person who called it unfair had just met with the man whose family profits most from the bridge staying closed. Here's what every other outlet is missing. They are covering this as a diplomatic dispute. They are covering it as a tariff negotiation side story. They are covering it as another Trump versus Canada flashpoint in a long list of flashpoints. And all of those framings are real. But they are covering the symptom, not the surgery. The surgery is happening on the infrastructure itself. Because what is actually being decided right now, in the gap between the bridge being physically open and the bridge being legally permitted to operate, is whether private monopoly power over critical public infrastructure can be preserved through political intervention when the market itself has already voted to move on. Let me translate that for you. Canada built a public bridge. It is done. The lights are tested. The tolls are programmed. More than 12,000 transponders are ordered. The U.S. federal government formally designated it as a port of entry, and it is not open. Not because anything is wrong with the bridge, because a billionaire whose family has spent millions lobbying the White House had a meeting with the Commerce Secretary, and hours later, the President of the United States threatened to block it. In plain language, that means the United States government is currently protecting the toll revenue of a private family by keeping a public infrastructure project from opening. That is what is actually happening. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think the Gordie Howe Bridge opens before summer 2026? Or does Trump's political pressure hold it shut past the season? I genuinely want to know what you think is coming. Now let's go one level deeper, because once you understand what is really happening here, 3 analytical moves snap into place that nobody else has laid out in sequence. The first move is understanding what kind of institution the Ambassador Bridge actually is. It is not infrastructure in any meaningful civic sense. It is a toll booth empire that happens to span an international river. Matty Maroon built his business model on monopoly geography, the recognition that if you own the only crossing at the most commercially dense point on the US-Canada border, you do not need to compete. You just need to hold. That model worked spectacularly for 4 decades, through NAFTA, through the automotive boom, through the rise of just-in-time manufacturing. Forbes estimated the bridge earned over $60 million annually in toll revenue. The Maroon family sued the Canadian and Michigan governments to stop the Gordie Howe Bridge from being built. They argued in court that they had an exclusive right to collect tolls on Detroit River crossings. They lost. But they pivoted from litigation to lobbying, and that pivot eventually landed them in a meeting with Howard Lutnick. In plain language, that means when you cannot win in court, you buy access to the executive branch. The second move is understanding Trump's incentive structure here, which is not primarily about trade fairness. It is about leverage. The USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, is up for renegotiation in 2026. The Gordie Howe Bridge is a ready-made pressure point. It is built, it is visible, it is valuable to Canada, and its opening can be delayed by executive action without requiring legislation. Trump used it exactly the way any negotiator uses a chip. He made it conditional. Canada showed restraint in its response, focusing on the terms of the 2012 agreement rather than escalating rhetorically, Because Ottawa calculated that the bridge's economic logic was strong enough to survive the political theater. Prime Minister Mark Carney said publicly he expected the issue to be resolved. What that actually tells you is that Canada was betting on Michigan's own economic self-interest to do the lobbying that Ottawa couldn't. The third move is recognizing what Michigan's response revealed. The reaction inside Michigan was immediate and bipartisan at the economic level. Senator Alyssa Slotkin, a Democrat, warned that blocking the bridge would have, in her words, serious repercussions, raising costs for businesses, weakening supply chains, and costing jobs in a state that depends on cross-border trade. Governor Gretchen Whitmer said it was important that the bridge continue to move forward and open on time. Even some Republican voices in the state acknowledged that the bridge's opening was in Michigan's interest. The one significant Republican exception, House Speaker Matt Hall, framed Trump's threat as smart leverage, calling him the ultimate deal maker. Notice what Hall did not do. He did not cite a single economic study. He did not identify a single specific concession Canada should make. He offered a posture, not a position. What that actually tells you is that when elected officials can only defend a policy as a personality trait of the president, they are not defending a policy. They are performing loyalty. And Michigan's workers are paying the tab. The doctrine that emerges from all three moves is what you might call the monopoly preservation playbook. It has 3 stages. Stage 1, use litigation to block competition. Stage 2, when litigation fails, use lobbying to access executive power. Stage 3, frame private profit protection as national interest. The Moran family executed all 3 stages in sequence, and the bridge is still closed. Now let's hear from the people who study this for a living. Maddie Semiaticki, a professor of geography and urban planning at the University of Toronto, put it plainly when speaking to CBC News about the nature of the public-private partnership structure governing the Gordie Howe project. He said that P3 arrangements have repeatedly proven adversarial, that risk gets transferred on paper, but governments end up absorbing the costs when things go wrong. He warned that what sounds like shared responsibility often becomes a battle over who actually pays. His analysis connects directly to the Gordie Howe delays. The technology testing and systems commissioning that pushed the opening from fall 2025 into spring 2026 are exactly the kind of ambiguous handover moments where P3 friction tends to concentrate. Roy Norton, Canada's former Consul General to Detroit from 2010 to 2014, told the Detroit News that the Gordie Howe toll rates were set at what he called reasonable levels compared to the rates the Ambassador Bridge has been charging in recent years. Norton was careful not to accuse the Maroon operation of price gouging, but he noted that the Ambassador Bridge's recent toll increases had clearly driven traffic away, and that the Gordie Howe rates reflected what the corridor should have been charging all along. His institutional knowledge of the Windsor-Detroit relationship gives that assessment particular weight. This was not an advocate. This was a former diplomat who spent 4 years managing the politics of exactly this border corridor. Chris Douglas, an economist at the University of Michigan Flint, who has studied the Ambassador Bridge's financial model extensively, made a point that cuts through the political noise. He noted that because the Ambassador Bridge Company is privately held, it is exempt from the financial disclosure requirements that would apply to any publicly owned crossing. The public cannot know how much the Maroon family actually earns, cannot know what the true profit margins are, cannot know how much of the Trump lobbying expenditure was covered by revenues extracted from the trucking companies, and by extension from consumers, who had no alternative crossing to use. He estimated the toll revenue loss at $30 million annually once the Gordie Howe opens. The real number may be much higher. And when economists at two separate Michigan universities, a former Canadian diplomat, and an infrastructure policy researcher at one of Canada's leading universities, all point to the same structural dysfunction, the privatization of a public corridor, and the political machinery protecting that privatization, you pay attention. To be fair, there is a legitimate version of the counter-argument. The Ambassador Bridge is nearly 100 years old. It requires continuous maintenance, structural upkeep, and operational staffing at a privately funded level that public crossings are not subject to. The Maroon family's toll rates reflect not just profit extraction, but the genuine cost of operating aging infrastructure without government subsidy. That is a real distinction. If you eliminate the toll premium entirely, you potentially eliminate the private sector's incentive to maintain the crossing. And public crossings have their own well-documented history of deferred maintenance and bureaucratic delay. The Blue Water Bridge itself took years of federal lobbying to get its plaza upgrades funded. Furthermore, there is an argument that Trump's demand for USMCA leverage is not entirely divorced from legitimate trade concerns. Canada's supply-managed dairy sector, its digital services tax targeting American companies, and its historic resistance to reciprocal market access in certain sectors are genuine irritants in the bilateral relationship. Using a pending infrastructure decision as a negotiating chip is aggressive, but it is not categorically different from the kind of strategic linkage that trade negotiators use routinely. The question is whether the specific mechanism threatening to block a completed bridge that Michigan itself benefits from is a proportionate or coherent way to make that argument. Here is why both of those counter-arguments ultimately fail on process, not opinion. The Gordie Howe Bridge toll structure was not set unilaterally by Canada. It was benchmarked against the Blue Water Bridge and regional market rates. If the Ambassador Bridge's toll structure is genuinely unsustainable at lower rates, the market will demonstrate that, not through political intervention, but through traffic patterns. And those patterns already told us the answer. When the Ambassador Bridge lost its traffic dominance to a crossing 60 miles north, it was not because of a government mandate. It was because thousands of independent trucking operators ran the numbers and chose differently. The market already adjudicated this case. What we are watching now is an attempt to litigate it a second time in Washington.